Good evening, and welcome to another episode of The Long and the Short of It, Rangers After Dark, at Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, National Historic Site. My name is Ranger Meaghan, and once again, I'm here to talk about some of the fun, lesser-known stories about our park. And to celebrate International Day of Friendship, I thought it would be a lot of fun to talk about one of my favorite international friendships from history, the friendship of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and my favorite author of all time, Charles Dickens, as you can clearly see here in this picture of me looking up at him adoringly. Our story really begins in 1836 when a then relatively unknown author named Charles Dickens published what was to become a mega hit, The Pickwick Papers. That very same year, our friend Henry Longfellow was on an international tour going all across continental Europe and trying and failing to win the heart of his future wife, Fanny. When Henry returned home to America a little while later, he carried a copy of the Pickwick Papers with him and immediately introduced this story to all of his friends. And around the same time that Henry was introducing this story to his friends, the Pickwick Papers was becoming an international bestseller. Pickwick fever really hit America, and this was the beginning of really Charles Dickens's international career. Henry Longfellow himself formed a bit of a Pickwick fan club that he called the Five of Clubs, which was founded with him and his best friend Charles Sumner and a few other people, where the point of it was to, talk about their work and their interests and their hobbies, and honestly to fanboy a bit about Charles Dickens. The Pickwick Papers were referenced in so many of their letters, so many of their journals. It even got to a point where the club was referring to each other as members of the Pickwick Club. Henry Longfellow was the beautifully named Mr. Snodgrass, in case you were curious. Meanwhile, Charles Dickens was pumping out hit after hit. Oliver Twist in 1837, Nicholas Nickleby in 1838, and Old Curiosity Shop in 1840. What's really cool about this is that Dickens published these stories in monthly installments, which means people were reading these stories kind of like how we watch TV shows today. Oliver Twist was published over the course of 2 years, and Nicholas Nickleby was published halfway through its run, which meant that if you were a Charles Dickens fan, you had all of the Dickens content you could possibly hope for. And if you were in the mood to binge the rest of the story, a few months before the final chapters of these stories were published, Dickens would put it out in total book form. So if you wanted to spend extra money, you could get the final copy and be ahead of all of your friends. In late 1841, Charles Dickens finally decided he was going to visit America, and Longfellow and his friends lost their collective minds. But despite being Dickens mega fans, it wasn't actually the Five of Clubs that got to meet Dickens first. The moment he landed in Boston proper, he was immediately mobbed by thousands of people. And for the first few days, he was getting dinner invites and party invitations. His social schedule was completely filled up. And even though Longfellow really was excited to meet him, at first it didn't seem like anything was actually going to happen. Luckily for Longfellow, by pure chance, he managed to make an impression. The two of them first met at a play 2 days into Dickens's visit, and not long after, Longfellow received a personal invitation from Dickens himself to go hang out. On describing his first impression of Dickens, pictured here, Longfellow wrote, "He is a gay, free and easy character, fine bright face, blue eyes, long black hair, and with a slight dash of the Dick Swiveller about him." Longfellow was starstruck. And the feeling was apparently pretty mutual. A few days after their first meeting, Dickens let Longfellow take him on a private tour of Boston, where they walked what was essentially the Freedom Trail today. And then some. The two of them walked over 10 miles together in the middle of winter in Boston, and somehow remained friends. On Dickens's last day in Boston, he spent it with Longfellow and the Five of Clubs, having breakfast at the Longfellow house. And the next day, the entire club escorted him to the train station. Dickens continued on to other parts of America, but unfortunately for him, his experiences in the rest of the country did not match the experiences he had in Boston. Honestly, overall, he really did not like it here. But I'll talk more about that in a minute. Henry Longfellow, in turn, was having a very bad time as well. He was stressed out with work and schooling. Fanny was still rejecting him, and he decided that he needed a vacation. A mental health retreat to Europe. And somehow, Dickens caught wind of this and immediately wrote to him. "You are coming to England, you know. Now listen to me. When you return to London, I shall be there, please God. Write to me from the continent, and tell me when to expect you. Have no home but mine." Eager to give Longfellow the best impression he possibly could when he came to England, Dickens immediately bought copies of all of his poetry to give to all of his friends back home. And as I'm talking about this, one thing I really feel I need to put in perspective here is, all added up together, Longfellow and Dickens had only known each other for 4 days at this point. 4 days, and Dickens was inviting him to spend his entire vacation at his house. And Longfellow said yes. Longfellow sailed for Europe in May of 1842, and by that summer, Dickens was finally home. After touring the continent for a few months and spending most of his time in what is present-day Germany, Longfellow made his way to England in October. Pictured here, Longfellow wrote, "I write this from Dickens' study, the focus from which so many luminous things have radiated. The raven croaks from the garden, and the ceaseless roar of London fills my ears. Of course, I have no time for a letter, as I must run up in a few minutes to dress for dinner." While in London, Dickens took Longfellow everywhere. They went shopping together, they went to parties and dinners, they went to productions of Shakespeare. Everything that Longfellow wanted to do, Dickens took him to. And things that Longfellow didn't want to do, Dickens took him to. Dickens kind of made a lot of a career advocating for the plight of the poor, and even in 1842, it was something he was vocally adamant about. So one of the fun adventures that the two of them had together was Dickens taking Longfellow to the slums of London. Longfellow did not have a good time. On a happier adventure, though, another thing that Dickens took him to were some of the key places that were featured in the book, The Pickwick Papers. And Longfellow was so excited to visit all of the places that he had read about in this book, including Rochester Castle, where in that particular incident, Rochester Castle was closed for the day. And rather than leave and come back another time, they broke in. Charles Dickens and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow scaled a wall and broke in to a castle. Before long, Longfellow had to return home. And much like what Longfellow and his friends did for Dickens in America, Dickens did in return. He accompanied Longfellow to the train station, but accompanied him all the way up to the train station in Bath, clearly not willing to say goodbye just yet. They parted with Dickens giving him many bottles of wine, which were all drunk by Longfellow's friends in one night as soon as he got home, and with copies of Dickens's latest book, American Notes, for all of Longfellow's friends. And American Notes perfectly encapsulated all of the thoughts and feelings that Charles Dickens had about America, particularly the South and the institution of slavery. It was a damning criticism of America in general, with, again, the only thing he's saying favorably about being Boston. Edgar Allan Poe even called it one of the most suicidal productions ever deliberately published by an author who had the least reputation to lose. It did have a bit of a personal effect, though. Partially inspired by American Notes, and partially inspired by his friendship with Charles Sumner, Longfellow actually began to write poems about slavery himself, which would be published a little while later when he got back to America. Much like American Notes, Dickens's next story, Martin Chuzzlewitz, also didn't do particularly well in America. Most likely because he made fun of Americans incessantly in it. His rise to fame and hit after hit that he had seemed to have suddenly stalled, and one of his biggest markets was turning their backs on him. But while Dickens was hitting a bit of a rough patch, Longfellow was having the best time of his life. On June 15th, 1843, Longfellow wrote to Dickens, "Of late my heart has turned my brain out of doors. I am to be married in a few weeks." Longfellow had finally won the heart of his love, Fanny, seen here, and his fame was on the rise. With American Notes and Martin Chuzzlewit not selling and debts beginning to mount, Dickens was growing very desperate. Needing a success, Dickens's next book was written in 6 weeks. Production was sped up for it, and it was published just in time for the Christmas rush. This book sold out almost immediately. And A Christmas Carol put Charles Dickens back on the map. Over the next few years, Longfellow continued to read and support Dickens, writing about his new novels in his journals and commenting on them extensively. 25 years after their first meeting, Dickens decided to return to America in 1867. And after 25 years, enough time had passed that America had pretty much forgotten about their gripes with him in the early 1840s. And with hits like A Christmas Carol, David Copperfield, and Great Expectations, Dickens was in his prime. Stepping foot in Boston once again, he had a few main priorities. One of them being he wanted to see his old friends. And unsurprisingly, Longfellow was just as excited to see him. He attended almost every single reading of A Christmas Carol that Charles Dickens gave, bringing his children along with him. And almost immediately, the two of them began having dinner together as often as they could manage. It was even Longfellow that introduced Charles Dickens to an American Thanksgiving. And just like before, Dickens once again invited Longfellow to stay with him whenever he decided to return to England. And just like before, Longfellow accepted. The main difference being, this time he visited with the rest of his family in tow. In the 25 years the two of them had been on opposite sides of the Atlantic, their friendship never wavered, and almost parallel to each other, their fame began to rise, their popularity grew. So by the end of both of their lives, Charles Dickens was the most famous British author in America, and Henry Longfellow was the most popular American poet in England. And in what I find to be a really touching note, in some ways the two of them are kind of reunited. Both of them are represented in the Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey, with Dickens being buried there, and with Longfellow being the only American poet represented. And so, whether it is close to home or internationally, my question to you is, what is your favorite memory with a friend? Thank you for joining me for Rangers After Dark. We'll see you next time.